afternoon, everyone. Welcome this afternoon to this wonderful opening night of Eisenhower and Piece of Ground. But before the actual opening, later at 8 p.m., we have this wonderful conversation with the creators of the show. We have Richard Hellesen and Peter Ellenstein, who will talk to Jason, our artistic director, about the process of how this whole show came about. And you can ask him why Eisenhower, why now, everything what happened will be discussed in a little bit. And for those of you who don't know, I am Shruti Mukund, the Director of Community Engagement. And we're really excited to do a bunch of things around this play. The next Sunday, we have a conversation about the ranking of presidents in America. Isn't it really timely? And we will have a professor from UMD, David Carroll, along with James Mann, author and journalist, and John Rubinstein will join us in that conversation. So, and we will be having an auditioning class that John Rubinstein will host and have 5 chosen people audition for musical theater, and people can watch the process of it and him giving feedback and for people who are interested. So yeah, and October 30th, we will be doing a Promote the Vote event here. In fact, Kate, our front of house associate, is a part of the Yellow Roses, an local organization, and it's all about getting the community excited about voting, and there'll be the Montgomery County voters election board people. So if you want, I'm assuming most of you have registered to vote, but if you want, you can sign up to do poll working or learn more about what else the community is trying to activate about. So thank you, and without further ado, I welcome our guests and Jason.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. I am, as Shruti told you, Jason Lowith, the Artistic Director here at Olney Theater Center, and I am delighted to be joined by our playwright, Richard Hellesen, and our director and producer, Peter Ellenstein, from Eisenhower, this piece of ground. Have any of you, we only had one preview, did any of you watch it last night, by any chance? Okay. Spoiler alert, Eisenhower becomes president. So delighted to have you both here as part of our behind the scenes events, which I think many of you have been to. This is our opportunity to contextualize the work that you're about to see tonight, give you a bit of an inside look at how the work was made. Whenever we have an opportunity to work with a living playwright, that's really special here. And we're delighted to have Richard, who incidentally, if any of you, did any of you happen to go see the Lincoln show at Ford's that just opened this past week? Anybody? Well, if not, Richard was the dramaturg. He's an associate artist there at Ford's and has written for Ford. So I'm gonna brag on you both for a little bit and then we're gonna talk. So, and pardon me if it sounds like I'm reading because I partly am. So Richard Hellesen, to my far left, is the author of a number of plays for adults and young audiences. Obviously Eisenhower, This Piece of Ground, which is now, this is its 4th or 5th production. Just remind me.
5th or 6th.
5th or 6th.
Well.
New York, Santa Barbara, twice in LA. So this would be 5.
And then Ventura.
So 6.
And we even did it once up in Alaska.
In Alaska.
It's true. Yeah, in Alaska.
Oh,
He got to go. I didn't get to go.
So Richard is, as I said, an associate artist here at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. But his plays include the full-length Necessary Sacrifices, The One Act, One Destiny, which has over 1,500 performances, including At the White House, and The Road from Appomattox, and as a co-book writer, the 2015 adaptation of Frank Wildhorn's musical The Civil War, entitled Freedom's Song. His work for adults has been seen all over the country, and his work for young audiences include many shows, The 12 Dancing Princesses, adaptations of The Emperor's New Clothes, Esther Forbes' novel Johnny Tremaine. He is a bit of a superstar.
No, ask my children. I'm telling you differently.
And so is Peter. He's the artistic director of the New LA Repertory Company, which are the producers of this show, in fact. But he and I go way back to the early 1990s when I started my career in Los Angeles. And although we have yet to figure out how we met, we know we met there.
We met there, yes, and then I think we just met at TCG. Oh,
Sorry, yes, we definitely met way back when.
Way back.
Way back when.
Yeah. So
You were an infant.
I have looked you up on Wikipedia. I am not that much of a pioneer. Peter comes from a theatrical family, has spent 35 years in professional theater, film, and television as an artistic director, producing director, producer, director, consultant, actor, and teacher. For the last 20 plus years, he's had leadership positions in prominent theaters and academic organizations. He's directed so many plays, including the longest running production of Assassins, the Sondheim and Weidman piece. And he was also artistic director of the William Inge Center for the Arts, which is a very important, in our industry, a very important feeder for new work throughout the industry. And in fact, is that where you guys met? Because I know you've been a fellow.
No, we met before that, but I got to work there twice. He had me twice.
Yeah,
Which was nice.
all right.
I never made that mistake again. So.
We'll definitely leave a little bit of time for questions at the end, but let me get to some questions, if I may. So some of the obvious ones. Richard, you've done a lot of work in the history of playwriting Nexus. What made you think about Eisenhower? Where did this play originate for you?
And you should probably start with him because it was his idea.
Peter, where did this play originate?
So I was running the William Inge Center for the Arts, which is based in Kansas. So I was always looking for Kansas material, and I stumbled across a quote of Eisenhower's that partially appears in the play. And it surprised me because I didn't know very much about Eisenhower. My parents had both been dyed-in-the-wool Democrats and had voted for Stevenson both times. All I knew was that he was, he had that phrase about the military-industrial complex, and that he'd been the leader in World War II, and this stodgy old white guy. And I read this quote, and I was really surprised by it. It didn't match with what my image of Eisenhower was. And so I looked it up to see if it was real. This was back in 2011. And I found the speech it came from, and I read the whole speech, and I was blown away by how smart, thoughtful, empathetic, long-range thinking it was. So I started to read some of his other speeches, and then I did a little bit more research, and I got excited about it. And I went, wow, we should do a play, one of the plays about Eisenhower here. And I started looking for a play about Eisenhower, and nobody had written one. So I called, excitedly wanting to speak to Richard about it to see if he was interested, and instead just got his voice message, his voice recorder. So I left a long message, and I'll throw it over to Richard from there.
Yeah, and we need to do a play about Eisenhower. My first question was, why? I mean, I love to write plays, and as Jason said, I've done a fair amount of work on history plays. It's a particular genre that I happen to like quite a bit, but you still have to have a reason to write one. You don't just write a history play, just write a history play. So we talked about it. He said, well, we could, it could be about contemporary politics. It can be about how America has changed over the decades, and said a number of things, and then we could get a grant. I said, okay, that's the thing. We never got the grant, and we may come back around at this point later. But I said, all right, I'll look into it. And so I did some research in Kansas and elsewhere, trying to find a hook. You sort of need a hook. If you're gonna write a play, you need a hook, you need a reason to write it. And I finally went back to him and I said, no. There is no way, there's no play here. I wouldn't know what to write. And then I made my mistake. I said, the only possible way, because his life was so amazing and covered so many areas, and I don't want to write a play with 6 guys in the Oval Office going, Mr. President, the Suez, because no one would want to see that play. So the only possible way, and it's not possible, this play might work, would be as a one-person show. And he grabbed it. I said, well, why don't you do some work on that? And so that's sort of where it began, sort of making that decision right off the bat.
But tell me more about that, about why you thought only as a one-person show.
I think because I was, and I had never written a one-person show either before that, so it was kind of a bit of a jump into the deep end for me. I guess my sense was that the more that I read about him, well, okay, this is actually what I went back to. The play that jumped in my mind, oddly enough, anybody remembers this play, was a play called Give Him Hell, Harry Truman. It was done probably almost 40 years ago with James Whitmore as Harry Truman. And I sort of had a sense, maybe something along those lines, because what it allows you to do, if you do have only one actor, is you're not necessarily grounded in a place unless you choose to be. You don't have to construct the conflict around something with one other person or one event. You have a little latitude to move. And I think it was responding to that idea that his life was so enormous. There was his childhood in Kansas. There was his going into the military, his entire military career. Then there was his presidency and all these things. The only way I could begin to conceive that you might even be able to touch on any of that would be to just let him talk. Give him a reason to talk, and I'm sure we'll get to that. And construct a play that will allow me to move through all of those things through the means of one character, not 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever.
And that way you didn't need a grant.
No,
It's only one
yeah.
actor, it's easy.
No, yeah, exactly.
Cheaper to produce. But let's talk about that, finding that frame, that inciting incident, that idea that would get him talking. At what point in your research, and I presume you did research together since the idea went this way. At what
Well,
point
we
in the
did research separately, but then we would share the research,
Yeah,
we'd send ideas back and forth. And he truncated a little bit. We probably came up with 15 different ideas of where we might set the play before he said, no, it's gonna have to be one person.
So how did you do, I mean, the president, I don't think it's a spoiler alert to say that sort of the inciting incident of the play, which is sort of delightful, is this actually a reproduction of that New York Times Magazine?
Yes, it is.
That's great.
Yes.
There's a New York Times Magazine article from 1962 in which Eisenhower is ranked 22nd of 31 or 34 presidents, depending on how you count them. And he's just read this, and he is very, very upset about it. So how did you, were there other ideas before you discovered that?
That was exactly it. I mean, I think my first iteration was he was somehow, you have 2 questions with a one-person show, which is, the biggest one was why is he talking? The second one is who's he talking to? Because if you have a character on stage, and I read every one-person show I could come across other than Harry Truman. I read The Bell of Amherst, the Emily Dickinson play. Some of you may know that one. I read this play about Truman Capote called True. There are a number of one-person shows, and every one of them has a different kind of hook. But there needs to be a reason the person is talking, right? Why are you conversing with the audience? How do you deal with the fourth wall or not? Are they aware of the audience? What is the point you're trying to make? And what's the construct that allows them to pursue that point? Because I think even a historical play, we can talk about history plays in general if you like, they have to be drama first. They have to work as drama, not history. So you're gonna have some compromises. So my first iteration, I think he would be talking and then he would go to like a pool of light and then do a piece of a speech and then come back out of it. And it was terrible. This is why you have voice baskets, okay, as writers. And then exactly as you said, I happened to be reading and I came across, interestingly, it was in a book written by his grandson, David Eisenhower, about Eisenhower's final years. And I came across a mention in this thing that in 1962, the New York Times published their first ranking of presidents by 75 historians, and he ranked 22nd out of 31, but there's a reason to see the play why it's 31. And according to David, he was irate. And at that point I had my hook, because then it becomes the reason to talk is to go back through your own life and see why you got ranked 22nd. And if you feel right about that, I mean, certainly all of us at a certain age who've lived a lot, in my extremely late 30s, if you've lived a lot.
I used to have bright red hair.
Yes, I did. Yeah. Just before we started doing this show. This is what did it. But if you had to go back over your whole life and someone was judging you, how you would feel. You would go back and say, yes, there were some things I did I'm very proud of, and there are some things I did I'm not very proud of. There's some things I would have done differently. There are things I look back now that I'm glad I did it that way. And so in his case, that's what allowed him dramatically then to revisit the lessons of his childhood, the lessons of his military career, the lessons of his presidency. It sort of as his own defense against the historians. So that was the hook. And once I found that, Then it really was, I was able to structure it fairly easily after that.
So tell us about
I disagree.
tell us about how much research you both did. Did you listen to, were you able to find recordings of, I mean, I presume having, if you started this process in Kansas, you could go to Abilene and you could go to his museum, listen to recordings and so on. So how did those, what parts of the research did you find really provoked you in terms to write more, to find stuff? Not in a bad way.
Because we were throwing a lot of stuff back and forth.
Yeah, well, we each read a number of biographies. A few of them we overlapped, but I probably read 3 or 4 different biographies. We both visited the Eisenhower Library in Kansas. You went twice, I think.
I think I did go twice, yeah.
And then we would compare it, say, well, what about this story? What about this idea? He writes, and then he writes a lot of stuff, and then he sends it to me, and it'll spur ideas, or I'll say, oh, I love that thing, maybe develop it more. But this is all him. It's not, I'm very good at like editing a little bit or just making suggestions. But he had the basic, as he said, he had the basic framework. How everything fit into the framework took us 10 years, or at least 3 years.
But I will also say, and getting back to the question, probably the crucial book that I came across, because what you're trying to do in any drama, because you're writing for actors, is you're not just looking for story, you're looking for voice. And if you are creating a character out of your own head, you get to create the voice. But if you have a historical character, what is the voice of that character? And the only way you're going to find that is from things that probably that they wrote or said. So yes, so film, we got some recordings I listened to out of the Library of Congress and also to the National Archives. But the key book for me was a book called At Ease that he wrote around 1962 or 3, around this time. And it was a memoir. It wasn't really history, it was a memoir. It was, the subtitle was Stories I Tell to Friends. And it was his firsthand accounting of growing up in Kansas and his mother and his father and his brothers and how he got into West Point and what he did when he was there. And it only goes up to, I think it goes up to the end of the war, and the last chapters are when he's talking about going to Europe to do NATO. And then at the end of it, they're asking him to come back and run for president. That's where the book ends. But it's first person. And he did it by sitting at his farm in Gettysburg and recording it. Yeah. So the tapes are also in the National Archives. So this is a tape recorder. So I'm thinking, well, he's going to talk to people. Wait a minute. He also recorded this book. How convenient for dramatic purposes. So that was what allowed me to get his voice. And the other book was actually, oddly enough, really crucial. And he mentioned this in the play. He had a very, very good high school friend named Sweet Hazlitt. And they were pals for Hazlitt's entire life. I would correspond with him in the White House. And it was like, they were trying to get their kids together to date. I mean, it was his old Kansas friend that stayed like his best friend for his whole life. And he would say, I'm in the Oval Office now, the workday is down the suite, I'm writing you a note. Okay. Well, the exchange of letters they had was very revealing. It was very personal. It was very honest about what he really thought about things. So it would get political or it would get social, but it wasn't a speech. It was the way you would have that conversation with your best friend about what you actually believed. So I ended up really between those two books, between At Ease and the letters between him and Sweet Hazlitt, I ended up with a great deal of material that really gave me his voice. And then I think it's just a matter of picking and choosing and boiling it down.
Were there things what were some of the things you discovered that absolutely blew your socks off, that were completely surprising about Eisenhower, that you did not know?
Everything. It blew me away that he was not considered an intellectual at the time at all, but he was an incredible intellectual in how he thought about the world and how he added all of his experiences together as he built on his sort of core values and built a philosophy and learned how to deal with people. But it was more that his long-range thinking and his ability to keep his eye on what was most important all the time, or almost all the time, which allowed him to deal with all sorts of personality types, not get triggered by them in the same way that many other people would and get thrown off course, and realizing that there's no perfect, that he's gonna keep trying to build towards the future. And there's just story after story that didn't make it into the play that we several of them got written into the play and then written out again because they interrupted the flow, or we already said enough of what that was in another place. I'll tell one little story that was very moving to me. He was a world-class bridge player and an excellent poker player that he won almost all the time. And when he was a young officer, they used to have a regular game. And there was another young officer who was, I think had just got married or was about to get engaged, and lost all of his money over a few weeks to Ike and a couple of the other guys who were better poker players, including all the money he was going to spend on the wedding and his honeymoon. And so Ike organized a game in which, without the guy knowing it, they lost all the money back to him. So that the guy could maintain his dignity, do it. And then Ike said he'd never again played with anyone who couldn't afford to play, or with anyone who was below his level where he felt like he would be taking advantage of him. And there are lessons all throughout his life where he would do something and he would make a mistake or feel bad about it, and then really do a lot of introspection to figure out, that's something I need to change about myself. That's something I want to try and do better. And that continuous self-improvement was, to me, something that was really surprising.
I definitely want to come back to that because the idea of a politician apologizing or having regret, which happens throughout the play, is not something I'm familiar with. So you started working on this 2011 because you're running an important program, very important program out of Kansas. Shouldn't we, this is one of Kansas's most important sons, shouldn't we write a play? This is 2011, now it's 2024. Shruti already said it, why now? Why now back in 2011? We now know kind of the answer. As you approach the first production in 2021?
2022, I think it was fall of 2022. It really started back up again, what do you want to say, 2019 maybe?
Because it kept going in and out of the drawer. I think I wrote the first draft in 2013. I think it was the first one, and it was pretty bad. And then I wrote another one that was also very bad. And I'm not giving anything away, but I think this is draft 23 that you're going to see. I can tell you a lot of what happened in the last 10 years. But I do think that it would go away, and then he would call me and say, well, we should work on Eisenhower again because something might happen in the world. So an event might happen. I would take it out and I would fix it, and then nothing would happen. And this is actually, I guess it goes to the thing about the grant, oddly enough, because we asked for the grant and they said no. And then we kept working on it and we kept seeing if anybody would be interested, and they kept saying no. And I actually had a friend who'd read it, and there was another theater, and she was working at that theater, and she took it to that theater, and they sat on it for a few months, and they said no. And so finally, it was 2000 and must have been 20.
Maybe it was 20.
Yeah, there was an actor. He said, at least let's get together and read it so we can hear the play where it is now. I think it was draft 4 at that point. It was horrible, but okay. And so he had an actor friend in Los Angeles, said, we'll get Tom to read it for us. I said, that's great, I'll come down. We both live in California. I'll come down. Only Tom, unfortunately, said no.
Well, he got busy.
He got busy and he couldn't read it. So I said, well, then you figure something out. So I'm literally sitting out having dinner with my wife, and I look at my phone and it's an email. And it's a forwarded email from Peter, from an actor named John Rubenstein. And I double taped, and John Rubenstein had said yes. He would be happy to read it for us. And so that was actually, in spite of all the work on the play, it really wasn't until we got the actor involved that things really kicked forward.
I do want to ask more about getting John involved, but as you picked it up again, whether it was 2019 or 2020, you were talking about maybe something in the world will happen. I'm not trying to be disingenuous, but why do you feel this play is important now? Is it more important? Talk to us about why it's more important than it was even in 2011.
Yeah, no, and I think what kept happening is that, sort of idea meets opportunity or something. And as politics in America evolved over the past decade or so, what we intuited about this subject, I think, suddenly was able to become more conscious in the creation of it. I've always kind of said to Peter during all this, we can't chase current events. We can't constantly rewrite the play to keep up with current events, because current events will always beat you every time. But if we can at least write to our sense of the world, as you're saying, and then 2016, and then 2020, and so on. So we weren't saying we need to say something about that. We were letting Ike be Ike. But the irony is that Ike being Ike sort of met the moment, if you want to put it that way. And so our sense that this is a play about moderation, that this is a play about values, this is a play about, as you say, politicians of a certain kind, that this is a play about a man from middle America, right, who really stands for all of those things that I think are really bedrock American values, suddenly becomes highlighted as a result of what's happening, rather than anything that we set out to do to respond to that, I think.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to ask, when you realized you had magic to do, what made you think that you had to call? Well, first of all, how many people know who John Rubinstein is? Awesome. So some of you are here. I've been wondering how many of you are here for Ike and how many of you are John Rubinstein. John Rubinstein, among other things, was the original Pippin in Pippin on Broadway, for those of you that don't know, and a long and storied career. But seriously, what made you think of John for this role? Peter, I know you even
honestly, when Tom couldn't do it, I was going, oh man, I need an older actor who's actually a strong enough actor who could read through this thing. And John had come out and we'd work together at the Inch Festival, and then we'd known each other for years before because he was running a small theater in LA when I was running Los Angeles Repertory Company. So we'd bang into each other, and we were friends on Facebook. We're both kind of politically interested, and he would write these long screeds and I'd write him a support thing. And so we were friendly, but not friends. And I wrote him and I said, hey, we've got this play. Do you have any interest? We won't take any time. We can read it once. We just want to hear it aloud to see whether there's anything here. And it'll take an afternoon and we'll buy you lunch if you want or whatever. And he said, well, I've kind of been looking for a one-person thing to do for a while that I could have that would be mine. And I kept playing around because he's a wonderful singer and musician and composer and everything. He thought about doing a musical one, but he hadn't found anything to work. And he said, yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do it. And he read it. And so we got together and I brought someone in, and just Richard and I and John and a young woman to read stage directions for us. And I think the play was about an hour and a half longer than it currently is. And we all met in the lobby of the Road Theater, if you know the Road Theater. And he read it aloud, and he had listened to a little bit of Ike, and so had found a way of kind of giving a flavor of the voice. And do you want to pick it up from there? Or no?
No, go keep
Okay. So he read it, and he finished. And we all kind of looked at each other and said, I think there's a play here. And he said, are you potentially interested in working on it with us? And he said, well, I'd be very interested, but I'm about to leave to go to New York to work on another play. But if you guys wanted to, I don't know how long it's going to run. It's kind of an open-ended. If you guys want to come out there after we open, I'm happy to work on all my days off, and we can maybe do it and put a reading together or something. And Richard and I looked at each other and said, yeah, let's do it. So we went to New York for 10 days. And I think Richard wrote 3 more drafts of the play. We would rehearse with John, and then we'd have consults, and he'd go and throw things out, put things back in. And we finally put together a reading just for invited friends and industry people. actually at Theater in St. Clements, where John was doing his other play. And we didn't know what we had. As a side note, did any of you see the recent revival of Funny Girl that was touring the country? Oh. Well, the young woman who read stage directions for us in this reading was Katerina McCrimmon, who's now becoming a gigantic star for playing Fanny Price, but she read stage directions for us for the reading in New York. We finished the play in New York. One, there were audible reactions from the audience as we were going through it. And we finished the play and to ask questions of the audience of what did they think of it. And the conversation would have gone on for another hour if we didn't have to get out of the theater. Everybody wanted to talk about it. There were good ideas about things to do with the play and all that sort of stuff because it still needed a lot of work, but everyone was turned on in the audience. They were gung-ho. And
What were the questions about? What were the things, I mean, in terms, I'm now going more into the content of the play and politics and humanity of that sort of balance. What were the things that people were grabbing onto, wanting to know more about, wanting to discuss? Because even like after the dress rehearsal, there was a clutch of people out in the lobby, staff members who were like, I was like, what are you all debating? I don't know, they were all heavy debate.
well, in terms of the questions about the construction of the play, there was some stuff in there that some of the young people who had been invited didn't have context for. And we realized, we need to make sure we either really explain these things or set them up in a way that it doesn't matter whether they have the context. Now, of course, at that time, we had no projections. We had an idea of doing projections, but we didn't have any. We had no idea whether they would work. And so that was part of it, but then also it engaged people in such a way they started wanting to ask questions. And we got the Nixon thing from LSA here.
I somehow failed to mention Nixon in the first 17 drafts. I fixed it.
Yeah, I think it got added finally in New York, yeah. So, and other subjects, there were things, why didn't you bring this up? But we also invited to that reading a president and a past president of the Eisenhower Foundation, both of whose parents had worked in the Eisenhower administration. And they said they came ready to hate the thing. And we went out with them the next day, wasn't it? And they said, basically, you checked all of the major things that we would have wanted covered. And they said, the only thing they thought that we might have done differently, I think, was the relationships with the mother and the father, that they had a little bit of a different take on the balance of that. And a few other little minor notes, but overall they were very excited about it. In fact, both of them came and saw it later on in New York multiple times and brought people. And we did an event with the Eisenhower Foundation in New York.
I would say the flip side of the questions that we got was actually the very gratifying response that we had, not just generally about it, but because I had to decide in writing the script how much Eisenhower and how much me, which sounds a little ridiculous. Because it's Eisenhower, okay, but you're still gonna create it, you're still gonna work it a little bit, and they're gonna shorten some things, gotta be actable, you're gonna paraphrase some things, you're gonna whatever. But what I was very pleased by was there were a number of things that when I first read them, as the quote that you read, and I suppose it goes back to your question about being blown away by things, that I read and I said, I can't do better than that. He said exactly what I would want to say, and he said it 60 years ago or 70 years ago, and it did seem so relevant. That's, I think, what was so satisfying about that reading, was to finally understand the relevance from an audience's point of view. And give you one example. When I read the line, I don't know it because I'm not an actor. Anybody who argues for doing away with Social Security, unemployment insurance should be called what they are, which is stupid. Okay, now you look at that and go, come on, you wrote that right there. No, that's a quote. Okay? And what I found was some of the sharpest things that people thought he couldn't have said that were the ones that were most likely to be the ones that he did actually say. And that resonated.
I mean, it is sort of amazing how as you read it through or watch it, how very clearly speaking to this very moment. But now I'm gonna problematize things and make things a little more difficult for you. So, am I pronouncing this right? Where's my English language people? Hagiography?
Hagiography.
Yeah.
Yep.
How do you feel like you avoided hagiography?
I had to. That was actually a goal I set for myself.
Please explain the hagiography.
Hagiography.
So, sorry.
Yes, hagiography. Now, it is a work of art that idealizes and idolizes someone. So that if you write a biography of somebody that is completely fawning and just has nothing but wonderful things to say about him, that's hagiography, okay? And one of the things that we intentionally set out to, and I think I don't know how you were feeling about it, but I was very insistent about this, I recall, that it cannot simply be a litany of all the wonderful things he did and at the end he ascends to heaven or something. If it's gonna be an argument over that, if it's gonna be the fact that he's 22nd out of 31, one part of his brain has to be thinking, what if they're right? Okay, what if they're right? And
was the regret that you hear in this Eisenhower in your play, is that a regret that you read in his firsthand memoirs and so on? Regret about his stance in, like in Wisconsin, not taking down currency.
Yes. I mean, occasionally, yes. The degree to which we would be public about that, not so much private letters, much more. Because you're not going to come out, especially if you're a politician, and say, oh, I really blew that. Although, again, what's one of his great historical moments, which is not giving anything away, but it's in the play, was the note that he had in his pocket on D-Day, that if the landings failed, he was taking complete 100% responsibility for it and not blaming anyone else for it, which is a great, amazing moment. But any blame that's attached is to me if that fails. Remarkable. So he was certainly able to do that, but to learn from that. And I know that privately he did have that sort of feeling. So there's still a part of him that thinks, I'm not fond of historians. He's thinking, but what if they're right? I mean, we're all thinking about our place in history, and what if they caught me?
One of the things that some people, modern audiences may find critical about it are that there's things that we don't touch on that nowadays we look back and go, oh, that was bad. But at the time, since it was said in 1962, he would not have thought that. Nobody would at that time would have thought that because we were looking at it with a lens of over 60 years hence. And so now things have changed. And so there were some things we didn't go into because it wouldn't have made sense to go into them. What he was dealing with at the time was not anything like what is going on now in our sensibilities.
Can you talk about what some of those things were that were present in your mind?
That he would have been.
Well, things that are important now, like for instance, the coup in Iran.
Sure.
So the coup in Iran, now we look back on which was minorly funded by the CIA. They did not think it was going to work. But he kind of went, oh, okay, give it a shot. Which now we look back on, right? But the Shah of Iran in, it westernized Iran quite a bit, but it also eventually led to the back. But actually in 1962 even, the Shah had just done a victory tour of the United States. He was a celebrated thing. It looked like it had been this gigantic success. So there's no way but even when he died, he was still looking like it had been a gigantic
And I would say that
success.
probably most of those things that would be on my mind, that probably were foreign policy things. Both pro and con, because he was sure Vietnam was going to go bad, and he said it early. He knew it was not, because he'd studied what the French had done. He knew it was going to go bad, but he was the president. But I think most of them probably would be foreign policy things, because we were still in that extremely bipolar Soviet. You lived the Cold War. You were in the Cold War, which I think is something you mentioned earlier. Younger audiences, how we had to try to, I know many of you out here, I say Cold War, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't need to explain it. You remember the map you grew up with, which is not the map of the world now. And it was big red over here, and that's what drove everything from, duck and cover drills, everything else in their lives. And it's very hard to explain that to somebody who's a Gen Z person, that was the way the world was, just as a reality on a daily basis. And that was driving so much policy at that time. And you know, did he make mistakes? I think absolutely made mistakes in the context of what that was. That's probably, for me, it was probably more foreign policy things that I had to leave out.
Because, and because, at least in part because that anti-communist worldview, which had so consumed Democrats and Republicans in different ways, just feels foreign to me.
Yeah, it's a different time. And again, you get an issue because play, a novelist or a history book writer can spend all the time they want on this. Like, I've got an hour and whatever, 90 minutes or an hour or something. And I think the other challenge of a play is always, what's the middle that you aim for? That sounds terrible to say that, but you're gonna get an audience that's gonna be everything from people who know nothing about what I'm talking about, to people who have their PhDs in the subject. And you're gonna have people who were alive during the Eisenhower administration and possibly voted for him, okay? And people who have never even heard of the guy. So how do you construct a play that will get as many of those people in that short amount of time as possible to get a sense of the person and their world, without saying, and now I'm gonna have to take 10 minutes to explain to you the situation in, wherever. That's the challenge, because a book could do it.
Have you found the reception between LA, New York, and now, obviously you don't yet know what the reception feels like here, although last night was a great standing ovation. Do you have a sense that in different regions of the country where you've done it, at least these 3 regions, you're getting different reception, different responses, different interests, different ways into the play?
The short answer is no. It's I think it's touching the base notes of people, how people treat each other, how we think about the world, and how we would like, how we wish America could deal with itself and the people in it. And so I don't think that there's been there's a regional thing we discovered last night, which was hysterical. Actually, the last 2 nights. I'll let you.
But I would agree with Peter. I haven't noticed any, I think it does, aside from being, informative and whatever, I do think that it speaks to something we all sort of want. I know I do. Something we sort of yearn for in the contemporary, polity. And that's across the country. I'm sure if we did it in Kansas, we would probably have the same reaction.
Yes, I think completely. I think what he speaks to and who he was, I mean, he left office with high approval rating, but at the time, he was probably the most popular person on the planet and the best known person on the planet and the hero to most of the world for having done World War II, for having, done NATO, and then having, America grew enormously during that time after World War II. So he was admired by people and listened to by people, and people, felt, oh, here's someone we can trust. And we're all looking for people in the world that we can trust, and trust that our leadership, whether they make mistakes or not, because everyone makes mistakes, has the best interest at heart and is working for the good of everybody, not for their own, interests. And I think that's yearned for.
And agree, 100% wish fulfillment, is one of the joys of watching the play. And yet, 2 years later, 1962, 75 historians in the glow of Camelot, right, and this sudden young burst of energy from the Kennedy administration, all that out the window. Not all that out the window.
No, you're absolutely right. I think it was, it's interesting because we take those ratings so for granted now. We come out with the president, like every 5 or 10 years, they come out with them, right? And they change. This was the first time it had ever been done on a large basis. Kennedy loved it. The fact that Eisenhower was so low, he sort of chuckled. But there was a sense of, you remember Kennedy's inaugural was the passing of the torch to a new generation of Americans. And I think that was real at that time. I'm a baby boomer. I was born during Eisenhower, and I kind of don't really remember Kennedy. But that sense of the country, that there was a long stretch, if you go, Roosevelt to Truman to Eisenhower was a long, long stretch. And there was maybe a sense of being tired of all of this now. And Kennedy was such a breath of fresh air and such a change in energy and optimism and ideas about the world that I think at the time the historians just simply took Eisenhower and they threw him, well, you see the play, they just threw him in a lump, with a bunch of the older ones. And it's like he's just an old 70-year-old guy who golfs and he's got nothing to say anymore. He has nothing to say anymore. His ideas are played out and they're old.
I think also he was so, I don't even want to say humble because I don't think he was necessarily humble, but he did not believe in being a braggart in any way. So if something got done, that was good. This thing got done. That was it. He wasn't out burnishing his own image in the way that, as we talk about in the play, MacArthur did or Patton did. He was not a showman. He was not out there to be the star. He was doing a job.
Which I suppose that may have been the one thing that did occur to me when I was working on it that surprised me. I wouldn't say it blew me away because I knew a reasonable amount of World War II history, but I always wondered why of the entire general staff did Roosevelt pick Eisenhower? Why not? They thought Marshall was going to get it, and Eisenhower never even had a battlefield command. Why not Patton? The great battlefield command. Why not any of these people? Why Eisenhower? I think it went back exactly to that Roosevelt knew we need somebody who can bring people together, who knows how to organize, who knows how to, because that's what he did, a lot of that thing between the wars, who knows how to work with a whole different kinds of people. I can work with Patton, and I can work with Montgomery, and I can work with these people. And I can get them all together to do the goal that needs to be done. And it doesn't matter if I get the credit for it or not. We just get it done. That I think it was surprising to me that why that was the reason. And then the other thing I would say is, as we talked about, the rankings. And you can go online and you can find these, by the way, just look up presidential rankings. What's fascinating to me is how they change. And obviously we add some, and we won't get into it in the context of the play because it is part of the play. But you see, for example, Wilson has dropped and Grant has come up and Jackson has done something different. About every few years, we revisit. So this was the first visit, if you will, of these people. And then things have changed as we learn more, as more archives are opened, more study is done, more understanding of why someone did what they did in that presidency. Nixon has come back up somewhat. Why and how they did what they did compared to other people, especially based on what we've learned, how it affected our lives now.
I'm particularly excited for this. I think it's October 13th, Shruti, or Shruti? Sixth is the date that we have one of the guys who has done presidential rankings, part of the presidential rankings team for C-SPAN. I like one to grill him. We have a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry our conversation has gone long in a good way, but we do have a few minutes for questions. There's so much more I could ask, but I'm going to start over here, I'm going to go over there. Yes.
Well, I'm reminded as you're talking about my childhood. I'm a World War II war baby. Mm-hmm. But there was an underlying fear in the country. I grew up in a small town in Michigan. But I had a military dog tag, a gray medal, with my name, religion, all sorts of things on it. There was a fear that we were going to be bombed by the Soviets. Mm-hmm. And how did Eisenhower deal with that? And I'm just reminded of that whole era of fear that was underneath everything.
Yeah, and it's a great question because, funnily enough, when you talk about that, my frame of reference is Cuban Missile Crisis, which was then 1962, and then Kennedy. My dad built a bomb shelter in the backyard. Okay? And I think that Eisenhower's whole idea, and he does touch on this in the play a little bit, is if we can find a way to prevent rather than defend, we will be better off. And I think that was always his case, even in World War II. If there's ways, even throughout his entire career, if there's ways that we can forestall something from happening. I mean, I think Americans are really great at putting out fires and not always really great at preventing fires from being started in the first place. And I think I always had the feeling about him that was his goal as president, was if there's a way that we can prevent anything from happening, then we'll be able to lift the fear. And this is touched on in the play. You will see this in the play.
And I'll share one story that I kept trying to get Richard to put into the play, but he wouldn't do it. It came later, after we were already set. So, which is, NASA was created under the Eisenhower administration. We didn't mention that in the play. But one of the things Eisenhower did was he separated it from the military, made it a civilian organization, and intended to be open to international cooperation, because he didn't believe in the weaponization of space. And he thought science belonged to the entire planet. That's pretty forward thinking. And in fact, I think over 120 countries have had experiments or been in some way involved in the International Space Station. Well, that all goes back to Eisenhower. And his forward thinking, and again, trying to create a world of peace.
Thinking of the SpaceX rocket that just went to NASA astronauts today, I think. Yeah, Shruti.
So actually, I want to know what the joke was that you were going to talk about, that you said in the last 2 days you discovered
okay.
something regional.
Do you guys have something against Pennsylvania? Then I'm just going to leave it there.
I saw a hand over here, yes.
I don't know if this is true, so maybe your research will answer that question. But it's my understanding that Eisenhower ranked near the bottom of his class at West Point. And if that's true, could that explain why he was maybe a little more willing to admit that maybe he didn't have all the answers, and maybe he wasn't, the greatest thing since sliced bread?
Yeah, we do actually touch on that in the play, his rankings at West Point as well as his historical rankings.
And I wondered if there was a parallel with that.
Yes, very much. But I think you're right. I think he was the guy, and it was a bit of a secret fear of his when he sort of finished West Point. He didn't get all the people who ranked really high. They got great posts and they got great opportunities. They all got to go to World War I and fight in Europe, and he didn't. He had a little thing in the back of his mind. He thought he could imagine himself, I think he wrote it in At Ease, I imagined myself at some reunion 20 years from now, kind of fat and bald because I've been sitting behind a desk and I have no good stories to tell, right? And he kind of went, well, if that's what it's going to be, then that's what it's going to be. But his thing was two quotes he ran by. One was the one I think Fox Connor quote, which is take your job seriously, never yourself. And then the second one is take any job that you're offered. And at one point, Fox Connor, who's talked about the play a little bit, was a general who supervised him, sort of knew where Eisenhower was going to go. And he wrote him a telegram. He said, you're going to get a telegram from the War Department that's going to say you're assigned to this and you're not going to like it. Take it. Because it's going to put you under this guy, not this guy. And it's going to allow you to do this thing. So he really, at some point, felt things will be what they are, and I just need to do what I do, just do my job and let things happen.
And to speak to that, he served under Pershing, he served under Fox Connor, he served under MacArthur, he served under one other major general. They all loved him because he did so much work. He made them look good, and he didn't try to steal the spotlight or claim things for himself. So it was one of the reasons he rose, was because he was so good at what he did and supporting the job the other people wanted to do.
Yeah, and when you're 145th in your class, you're probably one.
And you do a nice job also in the play, speaking of that kind of, if humility is indeed one of his character traits, that sort of Mark Antony moment in 1948 of everybody, including Truman, pushing him to run for the presidency and then saying, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you. We have time for a couple more. Yes, there, and then John.
When I'm looking around at who's here today, and based on this, you've awakened, I think, in many of us maybe, some things that I had not realized. I'm realizing now that Eisenhower is the first president that I remember, and my parents, and all that, kind of a bedrock of what we were first introduced to. And today things are a little different, aren't they? And so it's bringing a lot of awareness of how we shape these values that we're using right now to sort of sort out how we're going to make it going forward. So thank you, because I didn't have that perspective before today. So thank you.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. Even before having seen the show. Awesome.
Right. But it's why it's probably sold out so fast. I think there are a lot of people who might feel the same way. Hey, we should pay attention to this.
John, and then one more over there.
Yeah, I mentioned to a couple of people that I was coming to see this play, and they volunteered, but they knew about Eisenhower. His military-industrial complex speech.
That was the first thing and nothing else?
They didn't remember anything else about Eisenhower except
The military-industrial speech at the end of his presidency.
that's Eisenhower to them.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So it's not, obviously not in the play because he hasn't died during the play. But apparently, according to his granddaughter Susan, the thing that was most important to him when he was dying was that his archives be opened up as quickly as possible so that people could understand why and how he did things and what he thought and what he learned that led to so many of his decisions. So that's one of the things I'm really proud of that we're doing in this play is we're getting that out to more people.
Like,
Yeah, Truman was given the honor, had the opportunity to integrate culture. But the subsequent challenges, I think, fell a great deal to Eisenhower. How would you, I assume, rate him and evaluate his performance?
That's actually a great question, and we deal with it in the play, because what I didn't know, I was assuming the same thing that Truman did it, because he issued the order. And I don't mind quoting this from the play, because Truman said we're going to integrate the armed services as rapidly as possible, and the line in the play is, and you can guess how rapid that was. In fact, it wasn't completed under Truman. It wasn't completed until Eisenhower came. And we talk about that in the play, what he chose to do. But I wrote the line, which is the true line, that baseball was integrated before the military. Okay, and Eisenhower felt very strongly about that. And there's reasons, as you will see in the play, why he felt very strongly about that. We also touch on Little Rock, because he felt it was extremely important. If a law has been passed, and that is the law of the land, then it needs to be obeyed. Okay, and you can really get down in the weeds about who's opposing Brown versus Board and so on and so forth. It gets really complicated. But his stand was basically, it's a legal court order. It needs to be enforced. It's the right thing to do. And therefore, if I need to send the 101st Airborne down to Little Rock to do that, then that's what we're going to do. Okay, if you're not going to take care of it. So it was obviously an extremely fraught time, but I was actually very surprised to find out that Truman didn't do as much as I thought he had done. Eisenhower did more, but as he also says in the play, that can't be all of it. And now it's going to be on Kennedy's desk. So, if you have to think forward in the play, now it's 1962, now John Kennedy has that. And all the things that are going to happen, 64 Civil Rights Act and so on, are yet to come. So it's very much in a transitional 15 to 20 year period that it took to get so much of that done. And as we know, we're still dealing with it. Yeah, it's a great question.
I wish we could continue, but I know that we need to get ready for the show this evening. And there are things that need to happen between now and then. I do know that I think after the show tonight, we do have copies of the play, and Richard, after the show, while we're waiting for, as people are coming out, perhaps Richard would be willing to sign some copies if you'd like. You can purchase copies of that, and Peter, I'm sure, would be willing to sign them as well.
And if you twist his arm, if you wait long enough for John to get out of costume and rest and come out, he's usually very good about signing things. But he doesn't like to be held to it, but he's a very personable guy once you get him.
Well, when you tell them, there'll be fudge afterwards.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you.